The whispered warning. The downtown mall pulsed with the rhythm of a normal weekday afternoon. Busy shoppers, the aroma of pretzels wafting through the air, and children tugging at their parents' hands for a chance at the arcade. Hidden in plain sight, a boy no older than 12 weaved through the crowd, his eyes scanning every face with an intensity that didn't belong to someone his age. His clothes hung loosely on his skinny frame, worn and patched, a stark contrast to the polished tiles and designer stores surrounding him. Ethan had no family, no home, and barely enough to eat most days. The streets had taught him two things: stay invisible and trust no one. But today was different. Today, he'd overheard something that made his heart pound in ways hunger and cold never could. It had started that morning, behind the mall near the delivery docks, where Ethan often scavenged for discarded food. He'd been hidden behind a stack of cardboard boxes when two men walked by, their voices sharp and hurried. All set for the operation. One of them masked. He was tall and wiry, his face partially obscured by the brim of his baseball cap. "Yeah," the other man replied, his voice rough, like gravel crunching underfoot. "The bag's in place. 30 minutes, and it'll all go down." The words froze Ethan in place. He didn't understand everything, but the way they spoke sent a chill down his spine. A bag. 30 minutes. His mind raced. What if it was something dangerous? Something that could hurt people? Ethan pressed himself closer to the wall as the men moved further down the alley. He heard the taller man chuckle. By the time they figure it out, it'll be too late. They disappeared around the corner, leaving Ethan alone with the echo of their conversation. He didn't know what to do. Who would believe a homeless kid with a tattered backpack? People avoided him on the best of days, treating him like part of the scenery, something to be ignored. But he couldn't just do nothing. Not when he could feel the urgency in those men's voices. Ethan slipped into the mall through the side entrance, his feet silent against the polished floors. He moved instinctively toward the information desk, where a security guard stood. The guard was tall and broad-shouldered, his gray uniform starched and neat, a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. Ethan hesitated, his heart pounding. The man looked stern, the kind of adult who might dismiss him before he even had a chance to speak. But he had to try. "Excuse me, sir," Ethan said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the mall. The guard turned, his brow furrowed as he looked down at the boy. "You lost, kid." "No," Ethan stammered, clutching the straps of his backpack tightly. I saw something. Outside. Two men. They said something about a bag and a timer." The guard straightened, his skepticism clear. "A timer? You sure about that?" Ethan nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir. They said 30 minutes. They left a bag." The guard exchanged a glance with another nearby staff member. "Okay, kid," he said, softening his tone. "Let's check it out. Stay close." As they moved toward the atrium, Ethan felt the weight of every passing second. The bustling crowd continued unaware, shoppers flipping through racks of clothes and sipping on overpriced coffee. Ethan's gaze darted around, his anxiety mounting. What if they didn't find anything? Or worse, what if the men came back? The guard radioed another team member. Possible suspicious package reported in the atrium. "Let's secure the area." They reached the atrium, a sprawling open space with a glass ceiling that let sunlight pour in. In the center, a large decorative planter stood surrounded by seating. Ethan pointed toward it. "There," he whispered. The guard approached cautiously, his hand hovering near his radio. "Stand back," he said, his tone firm but calm. Ethan watched as the guard peered around the planter, his movements slow and deliberate. Then he froze. There it was, a black duffel bag tucked beneath the bench. It was nondescript, the kind of bag that could belong to anyone. But the guard's expression shifted from skepticism to alarm as he examined it more closely. He pressed the button on his radio. "This is Carter. We've got a suspicious bag in the atrium. Requesting immediate backup." Ethan's chest tightened. The gravity of the situation hit him fully. What if the men were right? What if it was already too late? Seconds to decide. The atrium was alive with the usual energy of the mall. Children darting between stores, shoppers chatting, and the soft echo of footsteps on polished tiles. None of them had any idea about the black bag sitting innocently under the bench near the planter. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he stood just a few feet from the security guard, who now had his radio pressed to his mouth. "Confirm suspicious package," the guard, Carter, said in a low, tense voice. "Evacuation procedures in progress." This could be serious. Ethan felt like he'd swallowed a block of ice. Around him, the mall's atmosphere remained normal, almost mocking his fear. A group of teenagers laughed as they strolled by, carrying shopping bags and sipping sodas. How could they all be so calm when something terrible might happen? The guard looked down at Ethan, his stern face softening for a moment. "You did good telling me," Carter said, though his voice was still serious. "Stay close. I'll get you out of here." Ethan nodded, clutching the straps of his battered backpack so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't trust himself to speak. His mind raced, replaying the two men's hurried conversation behind the mall. He'd been on his own for so long, constantly battling hunger and fear, that this level of danger felt overwhelming. "Attention, shoppers," a voice boomed over the mall's PA system. "For your safety, please proceed to the nearest exit. This is an emergency evacuation. Remain calm and follow the instructions of mall staff." The casual hum of the mall shattered into chaos within seconds. People froze, looking around in confusion before the words fully registered. Then the scramble began. Shoppers abandoned their carts, food trays clattered to the floor in the food court, and the sound of running footsteps filled the air. Carter grabbed Ethan's shoulder firmly but not unkindly. "Come on, kid," he said, steering him toward a less crowded hallway. "You're not staying here." Ethan's head whipped around, his eyes darting toward the planter where the bag still sat. What if it's real?" he whispered, his voice almost drowned out by the growing noise. "Let the professionals handle that," Carter replied. "It's not your job to worry about it anymore." But it was Ethan's job, wasn't it? He was the one who had overheard the men. He was the one who had warned them. If it really was a bomb, and if something went wrong, wouldn't it be his fault for not doing more? Carter handed Ethan off to another security officer near the side exit. "Get him outside," Carter ordered, before turning back toward the atrium. The officer nodded, guiding Ethan toward the exit, but Ethan's feet felt like lead. He couldn't leave. He had heard the urgency in those men's voices, the certainty. 30 minutes. He stopped walking, yanking his arm free from the officer's loose grip. "Wait," Ethan exclaimed, his voice breaking. "You don't understand. It's not just the bag. They said something about more. More than one place." The officer paused, frowning down at Ethan. "What do you mean?" Ethan stammered, trying to remember the exact words the men had said. They talked about buying time and spreading things out. They said something about how everyone would be scrambling. The officer's frown deepened, and he keyed his radio. "Connor, this kid says there might be more than one bag," he said quickly. "Think we should call for a sweep?" Meanwhile, Carter stood with two other security guards near the planter, his hand resting on the handle of his radio. He watched as a bomb squad technician approached the bag, dressed in a bulky protective suit. The technician moved slowly, his gloved hands careful as he examined the duffel bag. The evacuation was nearly complete by now, but a few stragglers lingered, curious onlookers who had refused to leave without a reason. One man stood by the escalators, pretending to record the commotion on his phone. Another leaned casually against a column, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. They didn't look like regular shoppers, Carter thought. "Keep an eye on those two," he muttered into his radio, nodding subtly toward the men. The technician crouched beside the bag, inspecting it closely. Then, without warning, he straightened and backed away quickly, holding up one hand in a clear signal for caution. "It's wired," he said into his headset, his voice tight but calm. Timer active. 17 minutes. Carter's stomach dropped. He keyed his radio again. Confirmed active device. Bomb squad needs immediate backup. Outside, Ethan paced near the barricades, gnawing at the inside of his cheek. Around him, the evacuated crowd grew restless, their murmurs swelling into a low hum of unease. But Ethan's focus was elsewhere. His brain kept turning over the fragments of conversation he'd overheard. He tried to remember the tone, the details, anything that might give a clue about what else the men had planned. What if the other bag, or bags, weren't in the mall at all? What if they were somewhere else? The thought hit him like a lightning bolt. He grabbed the sleeve of the nearest officer. "I need to talk to the detective in charge," he said, his voice trembling but insistent. The officer hesitated, but something in Ethan's desperation made him relent. "Stay here," the officer said, before disappearing into the crowd. Moments later, a tall woman in a dark blazer approached. Her sharp eyes locked onto Ethan immediately. "I'm Detective Reynolds," she said briskly. "What's this about other bags?" Ethan swallowed hard. "The men. I heard them say something about spreading thin and buying time. I don't think the mall is the only target." Reynolds' expression darkened. "Where else?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted, his voice cracking. But they were talking like the mall was just the start, like they wanted to distract people. The detective stepped back, pulling out her phone and barking orders into it. "Expand the search perimeter. Check nearby public spaces, parking lots, anything out of place, and get me a list of events happening in the area today." Ethan watched as Reynolds moved with a calm authority that made him feel slightly less helpless, but only slightly. Back inside, Carter and the bomb squad technician worked against the clock. The technician's hands moved with practiced precision as he examined the tangle of wires inside the duffel bag. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the air-conditioned atrium. "Red wire or yellow?" he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. "Just pick one," Carter urged, his own pulse pounding. The timer on the device glared at them, counting down, 0:10:42. The technician hesitated for one agonizing second, then reached for the red wire with a steady hand. He cut it cleanly. The timer stopped. The tension in the air broke like a dam, but it was far from over. As Carter stepped back, his radio crackled to life. "Detective Reynolds to all units. Possible secondary devices reported in nearby locations. Be advised, this might not be an isolated incident." Carter's eyes widened. The technician cursed under his breath. Ethan had been right. The mall was only part of a much larger plan. A web of deception. The mall was in chaos, but the evacuation had largely succeeded. The atrium, once bustling with life, was now a shell of its former self, eerily quiet save for the hum of bomb squad equipment and the muffled chatter of radios. Ethan stood near the barricades outside, his nerves frayed. Every moment stretched endlessly as he watched the scene unfold from behind a line of law enforcement. Detective Reynolds was barking orders into her radio, her sharp eyes scanning the area for any indication of secondary threats. "I want teams dispatched to the convention center, the public library, and the stadium. If this is a coordinated attack, they'll target locations with high civilian density." Ethan tugged at her sleeve again, his voice small but insistent. "Detective, there's something else." Reynolds turned, her patience thinning, but her tone steady. "What is it, kid?" "I think." Ethan hesitated, unsure if his hunch would be dismissed. "I think they're still watching. The men who did this, they seemed sure it would work. They wouldn't just leave without knowing what happened." Reynolds studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to the officers nearby. "Keep eyes on the perimeter. Look for anyone acting suspicious. If these guys are watching, I want them found." Ethan's heart sank as he scanned the crowd. What if they were already gone? Or worse, what if they were planning to strike again before anyone could stop them? Back inside the mall, Carter remained in the atrium as the bomb squad technician began packing up their tools. The disarmed device sat on a nearby table, its timer frozen at just under 10 minutes. "We got lucky," the technician muttered, his voice laced with tension. This setup was crude, but the intent was professional. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. Carter frowned. "What do you mean by crude but professional?" The technician gestured to the wiring inside the duffel bag. "It's like they wanted us to find it. Not too sophisticated, but just enough to be believable. This wasn't about causing maximum damage. It was about sending a message. Or a distraction," Carter said grimly. His radio crackled, and he stepped aside to answer. "Officer Carter, this is Reynolds. Do you have visual confirmation of anything suspicious near the atrium?" "Negative, Detective," Carter replied, his gaze sweeping the empty space around him. "Mall's clear for now. Bomb squad's finished with the device." "Good," Reynolds said, "but we've got reports of a similar setup at the convention center downtown. Same MO, suspicious bag, possible active device. Get your team ready. We might need backup." Carter's stomach tightened. Another device. He'd been in security for years, but this was quickly spiraling beyond anything he'd faced before. Meanwhile, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. He glanced toward the parking lot, where emergency vehicles and police cars had created a chaotic gridlock. Amid the sea of flashing lights and restless evacuees, something caught his eye. A man standing just beyond the barricades. He wasn't panicked like the others. He wasn't trying to leave. He was watching. The man wore a plain black hoodie pulled low over his face, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked calm, almost too calm. Ethan's pulse quickened as he remembered the two men he'd seen earlier. Could this be one of them? Before he could think better of it, Ethan slipped under the barricade and moved toward the man, keeping to the shadows. His instincts screamed at him to stop, to turn back, but something deeper urged him forward. He had to be sure. The man didn't move as Ethan approached, his attention fixed on the mall entrance. He held a phone in one hand, his thumb swiping across the screen. Ethan crept closer, careful to stay out of sight. Just as he was about to close the distance, the man lifted his head slightly, his face partially visible under the hood. Ethan froze. It wasn't one of the men from the alley, but there was something familiar about him. The tattoo on his neck, a coiled snake with a dagger through its head. His stomach dropped. It was connected. Before Ethan could react, the man's phone buzzed, and he answered in a low voice. "Yeah, the first one's done. They're scrambling. Go ahead with the next step." The words hit Ethan like a slap. There was no time to hesitate. He turned and bolted back toward the barricade, his heart pounding. "Detective Reynolds," he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "I saw him. One of them is here." Reynolds turned sharply, her focus snapping to Ethan as he pointed toward the man in the hoodie. "Over there. He's talking to someone." Without missing a beat, Reynolds signaled to two officers. "Detain him. Now." The officers moved swiftly, cutting through the crowd as they approached the man. But as they neared, he spotted them and bolted, weaving through the evacuees with practiced ease. Reynolds cursed under her breath and sprinted after him, Ethan trailing behind her despite her shouted orders to stay put. The man darted into the parking structure, his footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. Reynolds signaled for backup, but the sound of sirens and shouting seemed far away as she pursued him deeper into the structure. Ethan followed as best he could, his smaller frame allowing him to slip through gaps in the parked cars. He could hear the man's heavy breathing just ahead, punctuated by the scuff of his sneakers against the ground. Suddenly, the man rounded a corner and stopped, cornered by a dead end. Reynolds skidded to a halt, her weapon drawn. "Hands where I can see them," she barked. The man hesitated for a fraction of a second, then pulled something from his pocket, a small black device with a single button. Ethan's blood ran cold as he realized what it was. "Don't do it," Reynolds warned, her voice razor-sharp. But the man's lips curled into a smirk. "You're already too late." Before Reynolds could react, the man pressed the button. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of Reynolds' radio crackling to life. "Detective," came the voice of an officer outside. "We've just found another device. It's active." "Where?" Reynolds demanded, her gun still trained on the man. "The stadium," the officer replied. "We've got 10 minutes." Reynolds' jaw tightened. She motioned for the officers behind her to detain the man. "Get him to holding. And get bomb squad to the stadium now." As the officers hauled the man away, Ethan stepped forward, his face pale. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Reynolds glanced down at him, her expression hard but not unkind. "We stop this. Together." Ethan nodded, his fear replaced by a steely determination. He'd come this far. He wasn't going to back down now. Racing the clock. The stadium loomed in the distance, its massive structure glowing under the setting sun. Thousands of people had gathered there for a charity event, filling the seats with anticipation. The faint hum of a marching band practicing on the field echoed in the cool evening air, blissfully unaware of the danger creeping closer. Detective Reynolds drove like a bat out of hell, her unmarked car weaving through traffic with precision. In the passenger seat, Ethan clutched his seatbelt, his knuckles white. His stomach churned with a mix of fear and adrenaline. How had a normal day of scavenging turned into this? How was he suddenly in the middle of something so huge, so dangerous? "Why are you bringing me?" he asked, his voice shaky but curious. "I'm just a kid." Reynolds glanced at him briefly, her sharp eyes softening for a fraction of a second. "Because you're not just a kid," she said firmly. "You noticed what others didn't. You connected the dots when most people would have walked away. That makes you more valuable than half the people I've worked with." Ethan didn't know what to say. No one had ever spoken to him like that before. It made him sit up a little straighter, despite the lump in his throat. The radio crackled to life, pulling Reynolds' attention back to the task at hand. "Bomb squad en route to the stadium," came the dispatcher's voice. "ETA 5 minutes. Evacuation procedures initiated." 5 minutes might be too late, Reynolds muttered under her breath, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. She slammed her foot on the accelerator, the car lurching forward with a roar. Ethan peered out the window, his mind racing. The man with the tattoo had said they were too late, but what did that mean? Was the timer already running, or was it something worse, like a backup plan they hadn't uncovered yet? At the stadium, chaos erupted as the evacuation began. Security guards directed the crowds toward the exits, their voices barely cutting through the rising panic. Parents clutched their children, ushers waved frantically, and spectators stumbled over seats in their rush to leave. Amid the commotion, a janitor pushed a supply cart down a narrow corridor beneath the stands. His movements were slow and deliberate, his eyes darting toward the access doors, marked "Staff Only." He paused, glancing over his shoulder to ensure no one was watching. Then, with practiced ease, he reached into the cart and retrieved a small black case. Inside was another device, identical to the one disarmed at the mall. The janitor knelt by an electrical panel, prying it open with a screwdriver. He worked quickly, his hand steady despite the chaos around him. With a few deft movements, he connected the device to the wires inside, then flipped a small switch. A timer blinked to life. 09:58. The janitor straightened, closing the panel and wheeling his cart away as if nothing had happened. Reynolds and Ethan arrived at the stadium just as the first wave of evacuees spilled into the parking lot. The noise was deafening. Shouts, car horns, and the faint wail of distant sirens. Reynolds slammed the car into park and jumped out, her badge flashing as she cut through the crowd. "Detective Reynolds, LAPD," she shouted. "Bomb squad is on the way. Clear a path." Ethan hesitated for a moment, overwhelmed by the sheer size of the crowd. Then he saw Reynolds motioning for him to follow, and he scrambled after her, his backpack bouncing against his back. Inside, the chaos was even worse. The narrow corridors were packed with people trying to leave, their fear palpable. Reynolds pushed through, her focus razor-sharp. She stopped abruptly, turning to Ethan. "You said they talked about blending in," she said quickly. "What else do you remember? Anything about where they might plant it?" Ethan racked his brain, his hands trembling. They said something about where it would cause the most noise," he stammered. "And," his eyes widened, "and something about power, like it would make everything go dark." Reynolds' mind raced. "The electrical room," she muttered. "That's where they'd put it." She grabbed her radio. "Reynolds to all units. Suspected device near the stadium's main electrical room. Send bomb squad there immediately." The radio crackled with confirmation, but Reynolds was already moving, Ethan close on her heels. The corridor leading to the electrical room was deserted, the noise of the crowd fading into the background. Reynolds slowed her pace, her gun drawn. Ethan followed cautiously, his every sense on high alert. As they approached the door, Reynolds signaled for Ethan to stay back. She tested the handle. It was locked. "Figures," she muttered. She stepped back and kicked the door hard, the lock giving way with a metallic screech. The room beyond was dimly lit, the hum of machinery filling the air. Cables snaked along the floor, and the faint smell of ozone hung heavy. In the corner, Reynolds spotted it, a small black device attached to the main panel, its timer glowing ominously. 0642. She immediately keyed her radio. Device confirmed. Timer active. "Bomb squad, where are you?" "2 minutes out," came the reply. Reynolds swore under her breath. "We don't have 2 minutes." She approached the device cautiously, her heart pounding. She wasn't a bomb technician, but she'd seen enough during her years on the force to recognize the basics. Wires of different colors were connected to the panel, leading into the device's casing. A single wire, red, connected to the timer. "Stay back, Ethan," she ordered, her voice steady despite the fear tightening in her chest. Ethan didn't move. "I can help," he said quietly. "No," Reynolds snapped. "This isn't a game." "But what if?" "Ethan," she cut him off, her tone firm. "I need you to trust me." The boy nodded reluctantly, stepping back toward the doorway. Reynolds took a deep breath, her hand steady as she reached for the red wire. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her mind racing through the possibilities. Then, with a swift motion, she cut the wire. The timer stopped at 0112. Reynolds let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she stepped back. The room was silent except for the hum of the electrical equipment. She turned to Ethan, who was watching her with wide eyes. "You did it," he said softly, his voice tinged with awe. Reynolds managed a small smile, but it quickly faded as her radio crackled again. "Detective, we've got another issue. The man in custody is refusing to talk, but he keeps mentioning something about a final." Reynolds' blood ran cold. "What kind of final?" "Unknown," the voice replied. "But he says it's big." Reynolds exchanged a glance with Ethan, her mind spinning. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Outside, the evacuees cheered as the all-clear signal was given. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but Reynolds couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Ethan tugged at her sleeve, his expression serious. "There's something else," he said quietly. "The men at the mall. They said the real plan wasn't about the bags. It was about what would happen after." Reynolds froze, her breath catching in her throat. "After?" Ethan nodded. "They said the chaos was the point." The detective's heart sank. The bomb threats had been distractions, not just for law enforcement, but for everyone. Whatever was coming next, it would strike when no one was looking. And this time, they might not have enough time to stop it. The calm before the storm. Detective Reynolds tightened her grip on the radio, her jaw clenched as she processed Ethan's words. The chaos was the point. She scanned the crowd of evacuees outside the stadium, their cheers fading into background noise. It felt wrong. Too celebratory, too soon. If the threat wasn't truly neutralized, they were sitting ducks. "Ethan," she said sharply, "are you absolutely sure they said the real plan was about what happens after?" The boy nodded, his face pale but determined. "Yes, they kept saying it wasn't about the bag itself. It was about causing confusion, making people panic." Reynolds turned to the nearest officer. "Double the perimeter security. Check vehicles, alleys, rooftops, everything. If we've neutralized the obvious threat, the real danger might be hiding in plain sight." The officer nodded and relayed her orders into his radio. Meanwhile, Reynolds focused on Ethan again. Did they say anything else? About where or when this final might happen? Ethan racked his brain, biting his lip as he struggled to recall. His mind felt like a jumble of static, the events of the day blurring together. I don't think they mentioned a specific place," he admitted. "But one of them said something about watching the fireworks." "Fireworks?" Reynolds repeated, her mind racing. She turned toward the stadium, her gaze sweeping over the structure. Then it hit her like a freight train. The halftime show. "What about it?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. "There's supposed to be a pyrotechnics display during the halftime performance," Reynolds said grimly. "If they've tampered with the equipment, they could turn it into a disaster." Inside the stadium, technicians were scrambling to pack up their equipment and evacuate. Most of the crowd had cleared out, but a few stragglers remained. Event staff, media personnel, and security guards checking for anyone left behind. Reynolds and Ethan pushed through the half-empty halls, heading toward the area where the fireworks equipment was stored. The detectives' instincts screamed that time was running out. If this was the final the suspects had hinted at, they couldn't afford to waste another second. As they neared the storage area, Reynolds slowed her pace, motioning for Ethan to stay close but quiet. The air was heavy with tension, the faint hum of machinery filling the silence. She drew her weapon, her senses on high alert. The storage room door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the hallway. Reynolds approached cautiously, her heart pounding. She pushed the door open with her foot, the creak of the hinges echoing ominously. Inside, the room was cluttered with equipment, boxes of fireworks, coiled wires, and control panels with blinking lights. At the far end of the room, a man in a maintenance uniform was hunched over one of the panels, his hands moving quickly. "Freeze!" Reynolds shouted, leveling her weapon at the man. He spun around, his face a mask of surprise. For a split second, he hesitated, then bolted toward the opposite door. "Stay here!" Reynolds barked at Ethan before sprinting after the suspect. The chase was short but furious. The man darted through the labyrinth of stadium corridors, knocking over trash cans and shoving past employees in a desperate attempt to escape. Reynolds pursued relentlessly, her breath coming in short bursts as she closed the gap. Finally, she cornered him near a dead end by the maintenance bay. The man whirled around, panting heavily. His hands hovered near his belt, where a small device was clipped. "Don't even think about it," Reynolds warned, her voice cold as steel. "Hands where I can see them." The man smirked, his fingers twitching toward the device. "You don't get it, do you? It's already set. You can't stop it." Reynolds' eyes narrowed. "What's set? The fireworks? Something else. Talk, or I swear you'll regret it." The man chuckled darkly. "You think it's just the fireworks? No, this is bigger than that. You're all too late." Reynolds lunged forward before he could press the button, slamming him against the wall and wresting the device from his grip. She cuffed him swiftly, her mind racing. "What's bigger? Where's the real target?" The man stayed silent, his smirk fading into a stubborn scowl. Frustrated but undeterred, Reynolds dragged him back toward the storage room, where Ethan was pacing nervously. "Watch him," she ordered one of the officers who had arrived as backup. She turned her attention to the control panel the man had been working on, Her stomach dropped as she saw a second timer blinking on the screen. 0432. This isn't just controlling the fireworks, she muttered. Her eyes scanned the labels on the panel. And then she saw it. Gas release system. Her blood ran cold. If the fireworks ignited while the gas release was active, the entire stadium could become a fiery death trap. Reynolds grabbed her radio. All units, this is Reynolds. We've got a gas release system linked to the fireworks panel. Timer's running. Less than 5 minutes. Evacuate anyone still inside and get the bomb squad here now. Ethan stood frozen as the weight of her words sank in. What do we do? He asked, his voice trembling. Reynolds didn't answer immediately. Her fingers flew over the controls, searching for a way to disable the system. The interface was complex, filled with technical jargon and diagrams that made her head spin. Can you shut it off? Ethan asked, stepping closer. I don't know, Reynolds admitted through gritted teeth. It's rigged to detonate if we mess with the wrong settings. Whoever designed this knew what they were doing. Ethan's mind raced. He thought about the man they'd captured, the way he'd smirked as if victory was certain. Then he remembered something he'd overheard from the men at the mall. It's not about brute force, it's about finesse. Maybe it's not the main system, Ethan blurted out. Maybe there's a manual override, something nearby. Reynolds turned to him, her eyes sharp. What do you mean? At the mall, Ethan explained, his words tumbling out quickly. They said they always build in a backup in case the system gets messed up. There has to be a switch or something to override it. Reynolds stared at him for a beat, then nodded. Okay. Look for anything out of place. Panels, wires, anything that doesn't belong. The two of them searched frantically, their eyes scanning every corner of the room. Finally, Ethan spotted it, a small panel hidden behind a stack of boxes. He yanked the boxes aside, revealing a keypad with a glowing red light. Here, he shouted. Reynolds rushed over, examining the keypad. Good eye, kid, she said. She hesitated for a split second, then keyed her radio, found the manual override. Attempting shutdown now. Her fingers hovered over the keypad, her mind racing. She typed in the most obvious code, 1234, and hit enter. The light blinked green. The timer on the main panel stopped. 00:57. Reynolds slumped against the wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. You did it, she said, looking at Ethan. You actually did it. Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief wash over him. We did it, he corrected, a small smile tugging at his lips. Outside, the sound of sirens filled the air as more emergency vehicles arrived. The crisis had been averted, but Reynolds knew the fight wasn't over. Somewhere, the mastermind behind all this was still out there, watching. And she wasn't going to stop until she found him. The invisible web. The faint echo of sirens grew louder as the aftermath at the stadium began to settle. The bomb squad was sweeping the area, dismantling any remaining components of the gas release system, while officers secured the suspect Reynolds had tackled. The crowd outside was growing restless, their confusion and fears spilling over into frustrated shouting. Detective Reynolds leaned against a park squad car, her arms crossed as she tried to process the gravity of the day's events. Her mind was a whirlwind. 2 devices neutralized, but the pieces didn't fit. The chaos, the distractions, the talk of a final. It all pointed to something bigger, something they hadn't uncovered yet. Ethan sat nearby on the curb, his backpack on his lap. He looked worn out, his face pale and smudged with dirt. For a boy who'd spent the day dodging danger and saving lives, he seemed eerily calm. You okay, kid? Reynolds asked, her voice softer than usual. Ethan shrugged. I guess. It just doesn't feel over. It's not, Reynolds admitted, glancing at her phone. She was waiting for an update from her team, who were scouring the city for any leads on the gang responsible for the attack. Her gut told her they were running out of time. The mastermind behind all of this was still out there, likely planning his next move. The radio on her shoulder crackled. "Detective Reynolds, this is Briggs. We found something you'll want to see. Sending the location now." Reynolds straightened, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "What is it?" "A warehouse on the south side of the city. It's packed with equipment, timers, blueprints, and communication devices. Looks like it's been used as a base of operations." "Any suspects?" she asked. "Negative," Briggs replied. "The place is empty now, but we've retrieved some data from their computers. There's a list of locations. Looks like they've been mapping out potential targets." Reynolds felt her stomach twist. "I'm on my way." She turned to Ethan, who was listening intently. "You're sticking with me," she said. "If they're mapping targets, we might need your memory to help connect the dots." Ethan nodded without hesitation. "I'm ready." The warehouse was a sprawling, dilapidated building on the edge of an industrial district. Faded graffiti marked the outer walls, and the air smelled faintly of oil and rust. Inside, the scene was chilling. Tables were cluttered with blueprints and wiring, tools scattered haphazardly, as if someone had left in a hurry. Several computer monitors flickered with error messages, their power cables ripped from the wall. Reynolds approached Briggs, who stood near a corkboard pinned with maps and photographs. "What do we have?" she asked. Briggs gestured to the board. "This is a list of potential targets. The mall and stadium are marked, but there's another location circled in red. The central subway hub. It's got a note next to it. Maximum impact. Critical timing." Reynolds' blood ran cold. The central subway hub was one of the busiest transport centers in the city, especially during rush hour. If the suspects had something planned there, the casualties could be catastrophic. "Do we know when?" she asked, her voice tight. Briggs shook his head. "No specific time, but there's chatter on one of their encrypted servers about a deadline. Looks like whatever they're planning is set for tonight." Reynolds turned to Ethan, who was studying the corkboard with wide eyes. "Does this look familiar to you?" she asked, pointing to the notes. Ethan squinted at the handwriting, his brow furrowed. "It looks like something they talked about," he said slowly. "They mentioned timing being everything. Like they wanted it to hit when people couldn't escape." Reynolds cursed under her breath. "Rush hour," she muttered. "They're targeting the subway during peak commuter traffic." She turned to Briggs. "We need teams at the central hub immediately. Start evacuating the area and shut down the lines. I'll head there now." Briggs nodded and grabbed his radio to relay the orders. The subway hub was a sprawling underground network, its labyrinth of tunnels and platforms bustling with the evening crowd. Commuters hurried to catch their trains, the rhythmic rumble of subway cars filling the air. Above ground, the streets were congested with traffic, the glow of headlights creating a mosaic of light against the darkening sky. Reynolds arrived just as the first wave of officers began clearing the platforms. The evacuation was met with resistance. Commuters shouted in frustration, their evening routines disrupted. But Reynolds knew there was no time to waste. Every second counted. She pulled Ethan aside, kneeling to meet his gaze. "I need you to stay here," she said firmly. "It's too dangerous underground." Ethan's eyes widened in protest. "I can help. I was right about the other places. What if I can figure out something you missed?" Reynolds hesitated. The kid had proven himself resourceful, but taking him into the subway tunnels felt like crossing a line. Still, they were stretched thin, and his insights had been invaluable so far. "Okay," she said reluctantly, "but you stay close to me. No running off. Understand?" Ethan nodded, his face set with determination. "I understand." The tunnels were dark and humid, the faint smell of grease and damp concrete hanging in the air. Reynolds and Ethan followed a small team of officers as they moved deeper into the subway system, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. The sound of distant footsteps echoed eerily, amplifying the tension. "Keep your eyes open," Reynolds warned. "They could have planted something anywhere down here." As they approached a maintenance corridor, Ethan tugged at her sleeve. "Wait," he whispered. Do you hear that? Reynolds paused, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the distant hum of machinery. Then she heard it, a faint, rhythmic beeping. Her heart sank. "That's a timer," she said. "It's close." They followed the sound, weaving through the narrow corridor until they reached a locked utility door. Reynolds signaled for the officers to cover her, then kicked the door open. Inside was a control room, its walls lined with panels and switches. In the center of the room sat another device, its digital timer counting down relentlessly. 01236. "Call the bomb squad," Reynolds ordered, her voice sharp. "We don't have much time." As the officers radioed for backup, Reynolds examined the device. It was similar to the ones at the mall and stadium. But this one was larger, more complex. Wires snaked across the floor, connecting to the subway's power grid. This isn't just an explosion, she realized aloud. It's meant to take out the entire system. If this goes off, it'll cripple the subway for weeks, and anyone down here won't stand a chance. Ethan stepped closer, his eyes locked on the device. "There has to be a way to stop it," he said. "You stopped the other one." "This one's different," Reynolds said, her voice trained. "It's tied directly into the grid. If we cut the wrong wire, it could trigger an automatic detonation." Ethan bit his lip, his mind racing. Then he spotted something, a handwritten note taped to the side of the panel. The scrawled words read, "Failsafe active. Override code required." "There's a code," Ethan said, pointing to the note. "We need the code to shut it down." Reynolds turned to the officers. "Find the man we arrested at the stadium. He might have it." As they relayed the message, Ethan's gaze lingered on the timer. The numbers continued to tick down, each second pushing them closer to disaster. He clenched his fists, determined to see this through. The clock was ticking, and the stakes had never been higher. Against the clock, the rhythmic beeping of the device echoed through the control room, each sound slicing through the tense silence like a blade. The timer blinked relentlessly, the numbers counting down, 0:11:45. Detective Reynolds stood rigid, her eyes locked on the tangled wires and blinking lights of the bomb. Around her, the officers worked frantically, their radios crackling as they relayed updates and called for reinforcements. Ethan stayed close to Reynolds, his breath shallow but steady. Despite the fear clawing at his chest, he refused to back down now. He had come too far, and the stakes were too high. "The override code," Ethan said, his voice trembling but urgent. "If we can't get it, what happens?" Reynolds glanced at him, her jaw tightening. "If we can't get the code, we're going to have to improvise. But that's a last resort. One wrong move, and this entire place goes up." Her radio crackled. "Reynolds, this is Briggs. The suspect isn't talking. He's clammed up tight." Reynolds cursed under her breath. "We don't have time for this. Search him. Check every pocket, every scrap of paper he's carrying. The code has to be somewhere." "Copy that," Briggs replied. She turned back to the device, her mind racing. There was no way to predict how much of the system was rigged to fail if they tried to disable it manually. The complexity of the setup suggested this wasn't just about destruction. It was about sending a message, a psychological blow to the city. Ethan tugged at her sleeve, his eyes wide. "Detective, what if there's no code? What if the failsafe is a trick?" Reynolds paused, considering the possibility. It was a gamble, a calculated risk designed to paralyze them with indecision. Her stomach twisted at the thought, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. Her radio crackled again. "Reynolds, we found something." Briggs' voice came through loud and clear, a crumpled piece of paper in his pocket. "Looks like a code, 9-42-6. Want us to bring it to you?" "No time," Reynolds said. "Relay it to me. I'll input it here." "Got it," Briggs confirmed. 9-42-6. Reynolds crouched beside the control panel, her fingers hovering over the keypad. Her heart hammered in her chest as she punched in the numbers. The final digit beeped, and she hit enter. For a moment, Nothing happened. Then, a new display lit up. Failsafe disabled. Manual disarm required. Timer extended. The timer reset to 0:10:00. Reynolds exhaled sharply, but her relief was short-lived. We've bought time, but it's not over. We still have to disarm it manually. Ethan stepped closer, his eyes scanning the intricate mess of wires. What if we can trace where the wires go? He suggested. Maybe we can figure out which ones are connected to the bomb and which ones are just decoys. Reynolds nodded. Good thinking. Let's do it. The two worked together, tracing the wires as carefully as possible. Reynolds pointed out key connections while Ethan used his small hands to maneuver around tight spaces. The task was painstaking, every second feeling like an eternity. Sweat dripped down Reynolds' brow as the timer ticked closer to 0. Then Ethan spotted something. This wire, he said, pointing to a thin blue strand. It's not going anywhere. It just loops back into the panel. Reynolds studied it closely. A decoy, she confirmed. They've rigged it to throw us off. Good catch. She carefully snipped the wire, her hand steady despite the tension. The timer didn't stop, but the device's beeping slowed slightly. A small victory. Keep going, she said. We're making progress. Above ground, the evacuation of the subway hub was nearly complete. Officers directed the last few stragglers to safety, while emergency vehicles formed a perimeter around the entrances. The crowd of evacuees swelled, their murmurs growing louder as the minutes dragged on. Briggs arrived on the scene, his face grim as he joined the command center. What's the status? He asked a nearby officer. Reynolds and the kid are still down there, the officer replied. Bomb squad's 5 minutes out. Briggs clenched his fists. Let's hope they make it in time. Back in the control room, the timer read 03:15. Ethan's hands were shaking now, but he refused to stop. He followed another wire, this one red, which snaked into the heart of the device. This one looks important, he said, his voice wavering. Reynolds inspected it, her jaw tightening. That's the primary trigger, she said. If we cut it, and we're wrong, it'll detonate immediately. If we're right, it'll shut the whole thing down. Ethan's eyes met hers. What do we do? Reynolds took a deep breath. She was out of options, and the clock was running out. We cut it, she said firmly. But we do it together. Ethan nodded, his small hand steady as he reached for the wire alongside her. The two exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. On 3, Reynolds said. 1, 2. They cut the wire. The timer stopped. 00:09. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the subway's electrical systems. Then, the screen on the control panel blinked. System neutralized. Threat eliminated. Ethan let out a shaky laugh, his knees giving way as he sank to the floor. Reynolds slumped against the wall, her hands trembling as the adrenaline finally wore off. You did it, Ethan said, his voice filled with awe. No, Reynolds replied, managing a faint smile. We did it. Above ground, the all-clear signal was given, and the crowd erupted into cheers. Officers and first responders exchanged relieved glances, their shoulders sagging as the weight of the day lifted. Briggs received the update and allowed himself a rare smile. They had pulled off the impossible. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Reynolds and Ethan emerged from the subway tunnels, their faces smudged with dirt and exhaustion. The crowd parted for them, and a wave of applause rippled through the evacuees. Ethan looked around, his face flushing with a mix of pride and embarrassment. Reynolds placed a hand on his shoulder, leaning down to speak quietly. You saved lives today, Ethan. Don't ever forget that. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes glistening. You believed in me when no one else did, he said. Thank you. Reynolds nodded, her expression softening. The world needs more people like you, kid, brave enough to step up when it counts. As the crowd continued to cheer, Ethan couldn't help but feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. For the first time, he believed that maybe, just maybe, he had a future worth fighting for.